Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome my guest, Carl Wurtz. He's the president of Californians for Green Nuclear Power. Carl, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Thank you.
Now, I didn't warn you, Carl. Guests on this podcast introduce themselves, so I'm blindsiding you here, but that's the tradition here. Imagine you've arrived somewhere, you don't know anyone. You have 30 or 45 seconds and they ask you, well, who's Carl Wurtz? Tell us.
Okay. Professionally, I have a company that designs production management systems for industry. I'm semi-retired now, so I spend a lot of spare time working with my group, Californians for Green Nuclear Power. My passion is protecting the environment for future generations and promoting nuclear energy, because I believe that's a great way to do that, to achieve that end.
Gotcha. And where do you live in California?
I'm in Burbank, California.
Oh, okay. So Southern California.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Well, good. So you introduced yourself. So Californians for Green Nuclear Power. How old is this group? And what I see on your how you describe it on your website? But tell me what your group does and where we can find it.
Okay. I was not an originator of the group. The group started in San Luis Obispo in 2016. I was involved with early on. I've always been a passionate pro-nuclear supporter. I come from Illinois, where when growing up, there were 6 nuclear plants, all in the vicinity of Chicago and environs. And people do not have, it's a different culture. People do not have the fear of nuclear energy because it's just there. There are these buildings that generate a ton of great clean energy that don't make noise, that don't make any pollution, and it's just a fact of life there. Also, it's a pro-nuclear culture. You know, the Argonne National Laboratory, the Manhattan Project, a lot of nuclear development happened there.
Right.
So we learned as kids in school, we learned that nuclear energy was the way of the future. And at the time, you know, in the 1960s and 1970s, when I was growing up, the main problems, environmental problems that we faced were pollution, air and water pollution. And when I learned about nuclear energy, I just thought this is just a great way to get rid of all the smoke and the chemicals that are poisoning the environment. And so it was just a given for me at that time and for a lot of other people. So when I got out to California to go to school, I was just amazed at how afraid everybody was of nuclear energy. And I didn't know why. But I realized that, and this was quite a process for me. I realized that the unfamiliarity with it, people were forming their opinions based on movies and television reports. And television reports always exaggerate. It's got to be newsworthy. If it bleeds, it leads. But in nuclear energy, there has to be some slogan for that. But you know, so it was just a different mentality, and I had to try to understand that, to talk to people about it, because people were very dismissive of it. They say, you promote nuclear energy, why would you want to do something like that?
Mm-hmm.
And right. So, you know,
so you ran into so there's a cultural difference, and I want to talk about that, because I think that that's key about why this anti-nuclear sentiment is so strong in California. But I want to just jump to, if you don't mind, jump to the point about you're focused on saving Diablo Canyon, right? That is the immediate goal of, as I see on your website, that's the immediate goal of the group, dedicated to promoting peaceful use of safe carbon-free nuclear power and to keeping Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant open and operating. So if you don't mind, the cultural story is important, and I want to come back to that. And but I said this before we started. I wanted to interview you because I've been reading what you've been writing, and I thought it's some of the most succinct analysis of what's happening in the California electricity markets. But give us an update about Diablo Canyon. We just now, in the last few days, the Palisades plant in Michigan has been prematurely shuttered by Entergy, which bodes ill for Diablo Canyon as I see it just right now. But what's your feeling is now that Gavin Newsom has come out in favor of keeping Diablo Canyon open? Will that happen?
Well, I don't know that he's come out in favor of keeping Diablo Canyon open. What he's said publicly is that he supports keeping all options available.
Oh, okay. So I've overstated it. And so he's waffling a little bit. Is it weenie words or wiggle words?
I don't know. I don't know. Nobody really knows right now. I've been trying to find out information. I've contacted the Department of Energy. I've contacted PG&E, and it's very tight. People are being very tight-lipped about it. I won't. I don't distrust what he says about it. I think probably it's a political decision at this point because of the reliability problems we're having with our grid. And he's realizing that we don't have the baseload power that's necessary to keep the grid operating. And then I just heard yesterday that there were huge power outages in San Luis Obispo, San Luis Obispo in the Atascadero area.
Which is the county where the plant is, where Diablo
Right.
Canyon is.
It has nothing to do with Diablo Canyon, but
Okay.
yeah, I mean, I think people there are understanding how essential it is to keeping the grid going, because it's not because of Diablo Canyon that we're having these problems. And if anything, closing Diablo Canyon will make it worse.
Well, I think that's so abundantly obvious. I mean, I've seen different estimates that the Diablo Canyon by itself provides between 6 and 10% of all the juice in California. I mean, this is a very large amount of the share of the state's generation. I mean, compared to in Texas, no plant accounts for more than just maybe low single digits percentages. But this is a
Really,
massive.
South Texas doesn't generate that much. I thought so,
Well,
about.
it's about what is it, 2,000 megawatts, but our peak is 70,000 megawatts.
Oh
So
yeah,
out
right,
of, I mean, our peak
right,
is far higher than California's, right? You're at, your high peak is what, 40 or 50,000 megawatts at
right,
most, right?
right.
Yeah. So these plants in Texas. I'm not bragging on Texas. I'm from Oklahoma, but yeah, I mean it's a bigger state. We consume a lot more power than California. But so you're not sanguine that I've talked to some people that said, oh well, if Newsom is in favor, but he's using some words that say he wants to explore the options. So you think from what I'm seeing or what you're telling me is that this is not a done deal. That there's still a lot of work to be done if Diablo is going to be saved.
My impression, and I can't state this for obvious reason, but from what I hear from people who work there, from people who are involved with policy in DC, from what I understand, uh, they are working very hard to make it happen.
Uh
Let's
huh.
put it that way,
Okay.
behind the scenes. And there's a lot of pushback already from environmental groups, which was expected. But the bottom line is, it's working right now. It's safe. It's never had a serious problem with in an accident or anything like that, and that's by design. It's really a state of the art nuclear plant. Why not keep it running for another 10 years, and we'll see if renewables can power the state. 100% renewables. I don't believe that will ever happen, but if we need to try that, keep Diablo Canyon open and let's find out first. There are a lot of people. Solar is a very big industry in California.
Right.
People are very anxious to get a piece of this pie. It's a lot of electricity. And so, again, there's a conflict of interest there, you know?
Well, let's follow on that because you said something before we started recording. You said, and I want to make sure I've written this down correctly. You said there's a big difference between what's profitable and what's good for the environment. So explain that to me because you said solar has a lot of power in the state. So what's that big difference? There's a lot of meaning behind, or a lot of inference behind what you said there. A lot of the big difference between what's profitable and what's good for the environment. Explain that.
Okay, well, let me backtrack a little bit. In David Schumacher is a film producer, and he created a film in 2019. No, I believe it was earlier than that, 2018, called The New Fire, about new young people interested in nuclear energy.
Right.
And I contributed to the film. I met David, and he's a wonderful person, very active in our cause. But in a conversation one day with him, he explained to me something that I thought was really cut to the heart of why we're having problems with nuclear power. And he said, it's all about fuel. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, been having conversations with the head of the Sierra Club, with Natural Resources Defense Council, with Environmental Defense. I forget what the name is. Anyway, these big environmental organizations, and in closed door meetings with these people, trying to find out why this is an issue. I find out they say, yeah, we know nuclear power probably should be the way of the future, but if we come out and advocate for nuclear power, we'll lose half of our donation base right away. Like
See,
that.
I've heard this, almost the exact quote from Bill McKibben to, oh, who was the other? It was the journalist that McKibben said it in almost, I'm interesting you say it, in almost the exact same way. I mean, that, oh, if we come out, well, half of these people would leave. It was in a nuclear rally, and who's the late author who was a pro-nuclear, Bill Tucker. Tucker reported on this, that McKibben said almost the exact same thing to him now 6-8 years ago, something like that. But that's remarkable. So I'm sorry I interrupted, but I do that a lot. Go ahead. So Schumacher, you're finishing your point about Schumacher and him talking with these NGOs.
He said it's all about fuel. And I said, in what way? And he said, okay, global sales of uranium are $8.7 billion, or what were $8.7 billion revenue in 2021. Global sales of natural gas were, let me get my notes here, were $553 billion. Global revenue in coal was $791 billion. We have two orders of magnitude difference in
right.
profitability of this stuff. It's all about selling fuel. It's not about the nuclear plants. Nuclear plants are a minor expense compared to the amount of energy that's available for fuel. If you build a natural gas plant and get a piece of the fuel, of the money for the fuel that's running that plant, you have guaranteed income for 50, 60 years into the future.
Right.
And so it's a lot more profitable to tear nuclear plants down and build natural gas plants,
which is what we saw in New York with the closure of Indian Point.
Exactly.
And what we saw in Vermont with the closure of Vermont Yankee. That everywhere, what we saw with the closure of San Onofre. Whenever nuclear plants close, they're replaced by gas-fired generation. Is that your impression as well?
Absolutely. And natural gas people come out, Shell and Chevron come out and say, oh, well, we're looking forward to the renewables future too, and we've got this little solar farm that's generating a little energy, but it's all about fuel.
Well, but then how does that square? I follow you in terms of the coal and natural gas story, but then how does that explain then this mad headlong rush toward renewables? Because there's no fuel cost there, but isn't there a lot of money at stake as well on, you're talking about what's profitable and what's good for the environment. There's a lot of money in the renewable, in the solar and wind business, no?
Yes, there is. But as I think you're aware, solar and wind are 100% dependent on natural gas for backup power. And, they talk about batteries, and which is just, it's a non-solution for so many reasons. I don't even want to go in that direction now.
Oh, no, I'm going to come back to batteries because in your April 2nd piece, you talk about batteries. But so you're saying a vote for, well, let me see. Are you saying a vote for solar and wind is a vote for natural gas?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And would you put it that exact way?
Absolutely. There is no, as far as I'm aware, there is no solar or gas farm in the world that doesn't have natural gas to back it up. Natural gas is the perfect complement because it starts up quickly. It can adjust to variations in output. It's relatively cheap still, although it's getting more expensive.
Right.
But, there's really no other option right now.
At scale.
At scale, right.
Right. So let me turn to, before I turn to your piece that you published on May 2nd, which it was the reason why I contacted you to have you on the podcast. So what are the biggest challenges then in keeping Diablo Canyon open? Is that PG&E has already said it's going to close it and they don't want to back up? Where's the friction here? Given that I'm sitting here in Austin, Texas, when I look at California, I think, well, this is a lay down hand. I mean, this is so simple. Hello, duh. You're reliable. Don't want you to get technical, Carl. I know you're a technical.
Trying to sound like my son, Robert.
Hello, stupid. What are you doing? Your prices are going up. Your reliability is going down. You don't have enough generation. Yes, of course, you should reverse course and keep this plant open. But what are the key hurdles in making that happen then, in your view?
Robert, this is kind of what got me into this whole thing with San Onofre. Before Californians for Green Nuclear Power, I was actively involved in trying to keep San Onofre open. Uh, and
And
over
that's
the,
that's in Southern California, north of Los Angeles. Am I right, or is it south of LA? I'm trying to remember. It's on the coast.
it's between LA and San Diego.
Okay, so south of Los Angeles, and you're in Burbank, so on the coast west of you. Then, okay,
Yeah. Um, but it's just to get back to what we were talking about. The learning about why they're closing this plant became somewhat of an obsession for me, and it took me into a deep dive of not only California regulatory policy, but of the American utility standard, which became a standard for the world. Goes back to 1935 with the Public Utility Holding Company Act. And
hmm.
there's all kinds of little variations and stuff. And when you start talking about a utility regulation, people's eyes glaze over. It's kind of like,
Sure.
it's just not that interesting until you kind of understand the motives for why these things happen. But
But incredibly important. Little understood, but incredibly important. But anyway, and this is
absolutely,
again the American, say the what was the term, the caption for, what was that, the name of the law or the regulation?
the act was the Public Utilities Holding Company Act of 1935.
Right, but
And
there was a section. Yeah, I'm familiar with that. I've written a lot about that. But you're talking about a more specific part of that, of the Public Utility Holding Company Act, the American Utility Regulatory.
oh no, this is an informal. It basically created the American utility regulatory model.
Oh, okay, I
It's
see. So
copied throughout the world.
the framework that was set up in 1935 during the New Deal, that framework is what you're referring to. I'm with you now. Okay, I thought you were talking about
Right.
a specific section of the law or something. But please go ahead. I've interrupted.
Okay, so um, that created a framework that basically acknowledged that utilities are a natural monopoly.
Right.
So we have to regulate them. They weren't regulated in the 1920s, and utilities ran roughshod over all these people who were using electricity. They'd sign up for an electricity account, and all of a sudden, what? My bill doubled? How can they do that? Well, because they're a monopoly. You don't have any other option. Roosevelt, when he came to office, decided that access to electricity was as important as access to clean water,
Right.
sanitation, to police and fire departments. He decided that everybody had a natural right to electricity and they had to be regulated. He forced utilities to build the transmission out to farmers in remote areas, not because it was profitable. It wasn't. They fought against that tooth and nail, but because he felt that everybody had a right to electricity. And that's part of the reason why we have the amazing transmission system that we have today.
Right.
Anyway, so this utilities hated this from the very beginning. We can't have the government breathing down our necks, and they fought it every step of the way. But it lasted for 70 years until 2005 when it was repealed. And since then, we've seen what proponents of repeal argued for was, we're going to put power of the free market here. We're going to make electricity a free market commodity that can be bought and sold. We're going to have competition. The competition is going to keep the price down. But the bottom line was the retail consumer, the end of the road, was still a monopoly. It is for everybody. Nobody in the country has two sets of wires that come to their house and say, "Well, I'm going to pick Verizon electricity," or "I'm going to pick this." And that's the bottom line. You have no choice. And when that's the situation, it goes all the way up to the consumption framework.
Uh-huh.
In other words, you can't have freedom of choice in retail if you just make it wholesale only. It doesn't work that way. You still have all these conflicts of interest that basically take away the ability of free market to keep prices competitive.
So that the deregulation, if I can interrupt, because this is an issue that I've thought about a lot in Texas, right? And in Texas,
Right.
the Texas and California, the fact that Texas and California have had the same affordability, reliability issues in very different states, very different political systems, but you're going the same direction as how I've been thinking about this. Is this deregulatory framework has failed the consumer? Is
Yes,
that
it
where
has.
is that where you're going with
Absolutely.
this? So
Absolutely.
dive into that if you don't mind, and why does because it's a monopsony, right? The RTO controls is the only buyer, right, for the generator. So they don't. There really isn't a free market, but it's quasi deregulated. Is that how would you describe it?
Well, okay, here's what happened. The Public Utility Holding Company Act, one of the things is it made it impossible for utility holding companies to do business with their subsidiaries because they realized that all these affiliate transactions had what they were doing is they were buying natural gas from their own subsidiary, raising the price and presenting the bill to ratepayers saying, "Oh, look at how much we have to pay for natural gas. We have to raise rates."
Right.
And so what the Public Utility Holding Company Act was, they split natural gas and electricity. You could not have the same company selling natural gas and electricity
Right.
in a subsidiary or anything. And they actually got rid of all holding companies that had subsidiaries that were selling electricity and natural gas at the same time.
Mm.
After PUCA was repealed in 2005, they're back. Sempra sells electricity and gas. Pacific Gas and Electric sells gas and electric. And the same conflicts are coming back again. We don't know if electricity consumers in California don't know if Pacific Gas and Electric, the electric arm of Pacific Gas and Electric, which is a subsidiary of the holding company, is buying gas from the natural gas arm and marking up the price and billing ratepayers for it. And I've done some deep diving into the filings of PG&E, and it's almost impossible to find out what they pay for natural gas to generate electricity because they're buying it from themselves,
Right.
essentially.
Well, so
And
but isn't so the gas is part of that, but we also see these big utilities such as Florida Power and Light, NextEra Energy that has subsidiaries that are wind energy developers, right? So there's a whole other set of subsidiaries in these big utilities that are doing the renewable part, and they have a retail arm, right? So is that part of the conflict that you're seeing as well?
well, when they have a subsidiary and they're buying directly from the subsidiary, when the idea was they would, by deregulation, they would force utilities to spin off these companies so that they would be free market participants in a wholesale market.
Right.
But what Diablo Canyon or what PG&E did is they created a subsidiary for Diablo Canyon called Diablo Canyon LLC, and it's still their subsidiary. And so, in theory, Diablo Canyon LLC competes in a wholesale market for electricity, but in reality, all the profits flow through to PG&E Corporation. So it's really kind of a sham how deregulation has occurred. This is California. I don't know if it's the same in Florida or Texas, but
Well, so then let me ask that question because so has deregulation been good for the consumer?
uh, in the sense, no, in no sense is it good for the consumer. Um,
And why not?
because electricity prices are higher. They've shot up since 2005. If you look at electricity prices from 1960 in California, they kind of go up 1% or 2%. And after 2005, they go up at a 45-degree angle. It's crazy how expensive electricity has gotten in California. I think it's at one point it was the San Diego Gas and Electric was the most expensive electricity in the country, except for Hawaii, which is
An
a
island,
lot
yeah,
more.
right. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I'd be interested in seeing that pricing data because there's similar issues have been, are being discussed here in Texas that deregulation wasn't good for the consumer. That in fact, in regulated markets, consumers have paid less. But to me, the issue then is also about where the ultimate responsibility. If you had the integrated monopoly, ultimately, if you have some problem, well, you have somebody who's accountable. But that is it this excessive faith in the market? You talked about free market. Well, we're going to let the free market work in electricity. Let me ask it this way: why doesn't a free market work in electricity? Why we talked about this, but let me ask that question specifically. Why is it a failure in an intellectual failure to think that free markets can work in the electricity business?
Because it's impractical. You'd have to build separate transmission lines to everybody's home to have a separate retail market. And even though that works in software-based solutions like cable television, you can have two cable television companies working over the same connection. It's
Mm,
possible, but you can't do that with power electricity. It's still a monopoly for retail consumers.
Because it's a natural physical monopoly. You have
Right.
one
Right.
wire that's coming to the house, and because of that, it should be then a natural monopoly with one accountable company instead of Griddy or some of these other retail
Exactly.
electric providers that don't own anything but a telephone and a website, right? They don't own any wires, they don't own any poles, they don't own any generation, and yet they're an electricity provider. I've never understood how they're even an electricity provider.
And you and me both, and a lot of other people are starting to understand, are starting to wonder how that can happen. The people compare it, people in the industry compare it to deregulation of telecoms in the 1980s, but it's not the same physical thing. You can have as many different telecoms as you want. It's all radiation traveling through the air. There's no physical connection to your cell phone.
Right.
Um, so you can't just use that same paradigm, that business paradigm, with something where you need a solid connection with wires. You know.
Yeah. So let me read what your May 2nd piece, which, as I said, was why I contacted you, because I just thought it was, and I'm going to read this because I think you just stated it so very well. The title is called "The Failure of California's Electricity Policy, Part 2." And as just a quick station break, my guest is Carl Wurtz. He's the president of Californians for Green Nuclear Power. You can find him at cgnp.org. And you can also Google him and read what he's been writing lately, which is terrific. Carl Wurtz, Carl with a C, Wurtz. But you wrote this: it isn't a lack of renewable electricity that is holding California back. It's when renewables provide too much electricity at the wrong times and not enough when the time is right. It's attempting to lower carbon emissions by using resources that require gas-fired electricity to back them up or keep them from destroying the grid. It's putting blind faith in solutions that may work for flashlights or even electric cars, but will never be practical for providing the immense power needs of an electrical grid, enough battery capacity. And then you go into a parenthetical about batteries. But most of all, California's environmental policy is failing for a lack of honesty. The only thing remarkable about comparing last April's grid mix to this year's is their sameness. Despite all of CAISO's hyperbole, we're making little or no progress at lowering climate emissions. Some have simply been exported by replacing in-state gas consumption with unspecified imports, a euphemism for electricity from out-of-state gas and coal plants. I mean, you stated it so clearly there. Why isn't this getting more play? I mean, I read the LA Times, some of these reporters and the media outlets in California, and it's all singing the same tune. Oh, we're going to be more renewables. And you're saying, no, this is wrong. This is BS.
I think a lot of it is, it's kind of a complicated subject, and you understand energy. I understand energy, not probably not as good as you, but the physics of it. I mean, it's not necessarily easy. It seems logical that if you don't have enough renewables at night, just build big batteries and store it from during the day. I mean, it seems completely logical if you don't understand the physics of how batteries work, and why it's completely impractical to do something like that. So I think when you explain it to people, people just think, oh, you're selling for the nuclear industry or whatever, and you're just another special interest. We've got a lot of those already. We don't need another one. But I'm glad that you understood it. I'm trying to make it as understandable as possible for people who don't, because I think it's just so important that we cut through the crap and get a clean system of energy, one that's reliable, one that we don't have to wait for the sun to shine or the wind to blow to power the world's fifth biggest economy. It doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Well, and your reliability is just going down the tubes. I've seen, maybe you saw it, the report that was issued last year on the number of backup generators that are being built in California, in the Bay Area, and in Southern California. I mean, it's gobsmacking. I mean, that Californians are looking at what's going on and they're saying, hell, we can't rely on the grid. We're going to have to create our own microgrid because we don't believe this system is reliable. So, but have you followed the rate increases as well, Carl? Can you speak to that in terms of the affordability? It's something I'm very interested in. If that's not beyond what you've been working on, but I think the price increases are shocking as well.
I think the average price of electricity in California is 22 cents a kilowatt hour, which is among the highest in the country. San Diego Gas and Electric is particularly high. I don't know exactly why that is, but each utility is a little bit different. They have their own regulations and their own applications before the Public Utilities Commission to see what they can get. But I mean, that's one answer that they can't provide for you. Why is my bill so high? And people tell me, oh, well, solar is the lowest price electricity now. You know, solar and wind are at grid parity now. They can compete with anything. Why is my bill so high? That's what the bottom line comes down to, you know, and
that the facts around the bill don't match the rhetoric about cheap. I mean, I saw John Kerry last month on PBS said, "Oh, well, they're just solar and wind. They're cheaper. Then they're just cheaper." He said, "I think is and." But, well, there's no evidence in California that that's the case. California's pushed this experiment further than any other state. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you're in the vanguard here, but your rates are going toward the moon.
That's exactly true. And you know, we're not the first, though. We're not in the vanguard. Germany is in the vanguard.
Oh, fair enough.
With its Energiewende, and they have the highest electricity rates in the world. I'm talking about non-island countries. Island countries are a different animal, but of any country in the world, Germany has the highest. I'm sorry, Germany has the highest electricity prices in Europe.
Right.
I think they're in the world besides island countries, but just off the charts expensive. And you know, they say that, well, solar and wind energy is free. Then why are our rates so high? And there's actually quite a backlash in Germany against that.
Right. Well, and I think that's it. What did you say? If solar and wind are so cheap, why are rates so high? That's classic. Let me read from another piece. Well, actually, I want to where you talk about batteries. You wrote about this piece in April called "The Failure of California Electricity Policy in One Image," and it was a really good chart. And my spreadsheet skills are very minimal. I mean, very minimal. I don't think I could do the work that you did. But you showed California electricity demand, and then you showed the different types of energy and when they're produced, and very clearly showed the duck curve. So, can you walk us through there? And we don't have the image to show, but can you walk us through what that image says and why it matters?
Yeah, basically what it does is, and these are figures and cannibalized images that were available at California Independent System Operator, which is CAISO, CAISO.com.
Right.
And what they do is, the first time I saw their website, it looks very impressive. They create these charts of solar energy from 12 midnight to the next 12 midnight each day, the curve that it follows.
Right.
Obviously, it's during the day. There's this big lump in the middle. Wind is a little bit more regular, tooling along the bottom. Demand follows a very predictable curve, though, and that's the duck curve. They call it the duck curve because the back of the duck goes up like that. It comes down in late afternoon, early evening, and then goes up to its peak consumption about 7 or 8 p.m. at night, depending on time of year. So that creates kind of the duck look of it. And solar energy at 7 or 8 p.m. is virtually non-existent in California or anywhere else for that matter. So there's all kinds of ways. That's when gas consumption goes off the charts.
Right.
If we're going to decarbonize, we have to figure out a way to provide energy during that time. Anyway, part of the problem with the charts at CAISO is they show the supply, but they don't show the demand with it. Mm-hmm. So what I wanted to do is to overlay those two pictures to show why meeting 75%, or they say we generated 95% of our electricity from solar, why it doesn't make sense. What they're doing is when demand comes down like this and solar is coming up to meet it in late afternoon, they have to cut off solar, because if it goes if it generates more electricity than there is demand, it will take the grid down. You have to generate almost exactly the same amount of electricity to meet demand.
Right.
If it's too little or too much, the grid becomes unstable very quickly, like it did last year in Texas.
Right.
But
I think the key point there was that you pointed out that that at those peak times, and your graph shows this, that then around around 3 o'clock, 2 o'clock, that the state has to export a ton of power and pay neighboring states to take it off of their hands, which is truly remarkable. I mean, that now somebody, oh well, we just need more transmission, or California needs to interconnect with other states and have better transmission. Well, transmission is hard, which is a whole other separate discussion. But the graphic shows this dramatic increase in exports, and then that almost mimics the rise in natural gas generation as well during that peak period. So it's a really good graphic that you put together. But I think it's one of the things again that I thought, well, I need to talk to this Wurtz guy because he's done this kind of work. But I mean, what the hell? I mean, you're having to export 2,000 megawatts at peak, or more than that, nearly 3,000 megawatts at certain times in the day. This is an enormous amount of power.
And interestingly, this is kind of an epiphany I had the last week. They call it negative pricing, meaning other companies, we basically have to pay other states to take our electricity because we can't get rid of it fast enough.
Right.
Okay. So if we pay other states for electricity, we're violating Federal Energy Regulatory Commission laws for interstate commerce. So instead of saying we're paying them to take our electricity, we have to say we're selling it to them at negative prices. It's this crazy kind of double speak that they have to use to avoid getting prosecuted for interstate regulatory regulations.
It would be a violation of the Commerce Clause.
Right, right.
I hadn't thought we're selling it to them at negative prices, which is a euphemism for we're paying them to take this crap that we can't use.
Exactly.
I hadn't thought of that. I like that that way you framed it, and that is an epiphany. I hadn't thought about that. But so that their FERC regulations, walk me through that the FERC regs, which would be based in Commerce Clause about cross-border, interstate transactions, that would violate the Commerce Clause and FERC regulations?
Well, it wouldn't. That gets into a very, very complicated area that honestly I'm not that familiar with, because California has been basically apart from FERC for many, many, many years. They've generated all their electricity. They haven't bought any electricity from out of state, but that's changing very quickly. And so it's in flux very much right now. I know in PJM in the East Coast, there are all kinds of conflicts that people are trying to work out very quickly right now because of the internet, the national economy and electricity, both buying and selling. And that's a whole other subject that I'm not that well versed in.
Sure. But let me back up. But California, we talked about imports and exports, but California is still the biggest importer of electricity in the country, right? You import electricity from other states, including from Arizona, right? That was one of the things that some power from Arizona comes through California, and California is putting dibs on it, right? I mean, you got a big imbalance both in imports and exports, no?
Yes, we do. And the FERC regulations pertaining to selling electricity out of the state only pertain to PG&E, and that's part of the reason why they're allowed to. Again, this is delving into area that I have limited knowledge in, but they're basically saying that PG&E would have to abide by certain regulations that might prevent them from selling Diablo Canyon if they sold electricity out of the state. That's my understanding of it anyway.
Okay. So you live in Burbank. Do you have solar panels on the roof of your house?
No, I don't.
I have solar on the roof of my house, 8.5 kilowatts that I put on, and I got 3 different subsidies. And occasionally I feel pangs of guilt, but this is I got paid to do it, and this is the industry that I'm in, so I wanted to do the analysis myself.
People think I'm anti-solar, and I'm not. If you can put solar panels on your roof, go for it. It's clean energy because you're using it right there. It's debatable whether you're forcing other people to subsidize you. I don't think that's that big of an issue. It's where we start getting into these huge solar farms, 9 square mile solar farms like Topaz in Central California. That is just like, why are we taking 9 square miles to generate an average of 300 megawatts of electricity? It makes no sense. It's just way too much land use. And I'm a birder too, by the way. So we have that in common. And I see these environmental impacts that we're having on birds, on desert tortoises. It's people say, well, it's just empty desert. No, it's not empty desert. There's a whole ecosystem out there that is being hurt by these huge wind and solar farms. So if you want to put it on your roof, I'm fine with that. But there's no reason we should be taking up this much land to generate a little bit of electricity.
Well, look, I completely agree, and I didn't call just or didn't put you on the Zoom call just to talk about birds, but I'm an avid birder, and the idea that we're going to be leveling forests, we're going to be, covering the desert, it's crazy town. This makes no sense whatsoever. And so let me ask about the environmental groups, because they have been mute on these issues, largely mute, and big proponents of renewables. Here's the question. So, of the NGO groups, and I don't call them environmental groups, they're climate activist groups, they're not green groups, they're NGO groups. Who are the ones that you think are the most responsible? If you're going to say these are, Jessica Mitford said, you may not be able to change the world, but you can embarrass the guilty. Well, embarrass the guilty. Which groups are deserve the most blame and should be bearing the most guilt for what is happening at Diablo Canyon?
Well, the Environmental Defense Council, is it ED? I'm forgetting the name off my hand.
Natural Resources Defense Council?
Natural Resource Defense Council, Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, Sierra Club. They've all been fighting Diablo Canyon reopening, or they've all been advocating for it to be shut down. Union of Concerned Scientists. There are a lot of ones. There are conflicts of interest within their organization, in that some of them are involved in funds which sell solar, and on Sierra Club, on the website, you can buy solar panels. There are all kinds of conflicts of interest.
And what do you think, what motivates them? What's the game for them? What do you think? Explain.
Well, like I said, conflicts of interest. So if you're selling on your website solar panels, you have an inherent bias to promote solar as an environmental organization, even if it's not the best way to generate electricity, even if it has a huge environmental impact. There's an inherent bias in favor of natural gas too, as well, because we need natural gas to fill in the blanks for solar and wind. I don't want to get into specifics because I don't know the specifics, but they make it very difficult to find out the specifics of who they're getting money from. If you look at a lot of these nonprofit organizations, they will redact, $3 million contributions from this entity or that entity. And other pro-nuclear organizations, Environmental Progress, has done a lot of research into that kind of thing and has discovered a lot of I would advocate going to their website and checking out some stuff, because I certainly don't want to accuse somebody of something that they're not doing.
Right.
But there are conflicts of interest, no doubt.
Well, I didn't really, maybe I knew this, but I had to refer, maybe you just jogged my memory here, but yes, here's the California, this is the Sierra Club national organization, press release from March 12th, 2019. Sierra Club is providing an opportunity for its more than 3.5 million members and supporters to go solar with sun power. As part of the new program, Sierra Club members or supporters who purchase or lease a SunPower home solar system will receive a $1,000 mail-in rebate, and SunPower will give a Sierra Club $1,000. So they're promoting solar. I'm wondering if they've done any analysis on how much of that solar, with those solar panels, are coming from China, whether they can contain polysilicon from Xinjiang province. I mean, I'm saying that seriously. I mean, have they done any due diligence on any of this to see where where these solar panels are coming from? Because that's the other part of this, is about supply chains. Can you talk about that at all, Carl, in terms of supply chains and nuclear in the United States, and what, we're going to have to ramp up our own uranium, if we're going to ramp up our own uranium supplies, or get the Canadians to provide more? Where have you thought about that in terms of, if we're going to, you not only want to save Diablo, you want to build more nuclear. So have you thought about those challenges in terms of supply chain and where we go from here?
For uranium, yeah, I've done quite a bit of looking at that. It's been complicated by the thing with Ukraine and Russia. Russia provided, I forget, I think it was 15% of our uranium. Canada, I believe, provides most of it. Then Australia. Then there are several other sources.
Right.
Nigeria, I think.
Namibia, I think, is the right.
Oh, could
Yeah.
be. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
But anyway, there's a lot of uranium in the world, and once we get people, I don't want to get into nuclear waste because that's a whole other thing. But we have a lot of an incredible amount of nuclear fuel standing in upright casks as nuclear waste. When nuclear waste is committed to these upright cask storage, upright stash cask storage devices, only 5% of the uranium in it has been used.
Mm.
If it was reprocessed, we could recover 95% of that energy and use it again and again and again. So,
But the reprocessing is the pinch point, right? I mean, this is when we're going back to the Carter administration, right? In terms of doing that reprocessing here. But is it? When you say that, what pops in my head is, well, we need industrial policy in America, and we don't have it. We need a robust industrial policy to embrace nuclear energy and all the supply chains around it. But that's going to take time, and it's going to take a lot more Carl Wurtzes to make this happen. Is that is that?
Heaven help us.
But how do you see that? Do you see? I see some very encouraging signs. I've been pro-nuclear for a very long time. And I see some encouraging things happening. NuScale going public, right? You know the announcement in Eastern Europe that France is going to go full bore on nuclear. So are the Brits. There are a lot of things that are happening that are quite positive. And then there's the closure of Palisades, and still the specter of the closure of Diablo Canyon. Are you optimistic as you look forward at all of this? How do you you've been at this for a while? How do you handicap what's going on?
I don't know. It's very strange. I feel in one way I feel like we've got a very good solid argument, and the other times I feel completely out of control of the situation. Something will go. This whole thing with Diablo Canyon may go south. I have no idea what the forces are behind the scenes that are making this happen. But I think in the end there's a growing understanding of how important nuclear energy is for fighting climate change. There was a open letter signed by four of the top climatologists in the world: James Hansen, Kerry Emanuel from MIT, Tom Wigley, and Ken Caldera.
Right.
And the upshot of their letter was nuclear power paves the only viable path forward on climate change.
Right.
And the wording is very important. They said the only viable path, meaning that's the base load.
Right.
We can put solar on top of that, whatever, but we need the base load path to provide the power that we need day and night, and when it's windy and when it's not windy.
Right.
Because it will never happen. We'll never get rid of coal and natural gas without it.
Right. Yeah, I'm familiar with that letter. I think it was 2016, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not. Don't hold me to it, but I've quoted from it and written about it several times. Let's talk about batteries, because you also in your April 2nd, I think it was April 2nd, the piece called "The Failure of California Electricity Policy in One Image." You ask the question. You say, "What about batteries? Can't they fill in the blanks for solar and wind?" And you answer it. No, electricity produced by all grid-scale batteries in California is shown by the yellow line. It's hiding in the graph on the x-axis. For the purpose of making any significant contribution to grid electricity, batteries are useless. That's a pretty definitive statement. Why are batteries useless?
Because they're too expensive. It'd be like trying to power your car with flashlight batteries. You would have to have so much battery capacity. And I've done a bunch of calculations on this. It changes a little bit. The cost of batteries has gone down, but it really makes no sense at all. You would have to have over $1 trillion worth of batteries. And we're talking about 4 times California's annual budget each year, just to power the state for one day when there's cloudy weather, when there's little wind. And then after that day, assuming you've gotten rid of all the natural gas plants, the state goes dark.
So say that again. So you're saying that to produce enough batteries, and I'm assuming you're using Tesla Powerwalls as a benchmark or
Right,
something,
right. Yeah.
because I've done some similar calculations. But you're saying to produce enough batteries to power California's grid for one day would require roughly $1 trillion
Yeah. In battery capacity. Yeah.
to provide the capacity to meet that 24 hours of demand. I haven't done. I've done similar calculations, but I just wanted to make sure. So and there are batteries that are been. There's the big. What is it? Moss Landing, that the plant that Vistra owns. Do you know anything about what the status of that plant is?
Well, I think it's offline right now because they had a fire there a few
Right.
months ago. But when it is online, yes, it's the biggest battery farm in the world. Um, and Moss Landing, a lot of people don't understand another basic thing about batteries, and that is batteries are not charged by renewable energy. We see these paired facilities where they put all these batteries stacked up next to a solar farm, and we say, "Oh, this is clean energy. We're going to save it for later." Well, they're not charging from their solar farm; they're
Mm-hmm.
charging from a grid mix,
Right.
and because they're charging from a grid mix and inefficiencies in the batteries, they're wasting energy. They're making it dirtier than it would if it just came off the grid. So
Mm.
we're not
Because of the round trip efficiency you're talking about.
right, right.
I see. Which is
It
what
has
20 to 30%. I don't know.
That's
The
about
round.
right.
Is
That's
it
it's,
about
it,
that? 20 to 30% on that. When you put it in, you lose juice, and when you pull it out, you lose more juice.
yeah. There's what they call bidirectional inversion, meaning you have to convert AC to DC to go into the batteries, and then when it comes back, you have to convert DC back to AC, and that's not a perfectly efficient process. It's estimates go anywhere from 15 to 20% losses there. Then there's resistance inside the batteries themselves. Now, lithium-ion batteries are at least 95% efficient. They've gotten much, much better.
Right.
But there will always be these losses going back and forth. I mean, it's not perfectly efficient. It's not completely clean. I mean,
And
and the thing about
you have
Moss
and
Landing,
go ahead.
Moss Landing has no solar or wind farm within 20 miles of it, I think. It's charged by Moss Landing Power Plant, which is the fifth biggest natural gas plant in California. So it's charged by the direct output of a gas plant, and it's wasting energy. Um,
Huh.
so you're getting dirtier energy than if Moss Landing just generated the energy, but it's just allowing them to time shift it so they can generate electricity at night and then power the grid during the day.
So are they arbitraging? Is that the purpose of the plant, to arbitrage pricing and from different
Basically,
times of the hour, different times of time and day pricing?
exactly, and that's what the purpose of all batteries are. People say it's an environmental investment. Not at all. It's about buying low and selling high.
So again, follow the money,
Follow the money.
which is the oldest maxim in politics. Follow the money, right? Did they get was there a state subsidy in building Moss Landing? Was that part of why Vistra did it?
I don't know. I think there probably was a state subsidy for the batteries, but I don't know exactly how the funding
I
worked.
got you. Well, so tell me, just cast it forward. And my guest again is Carl Wurtz. He's the president of Californians for Green Nuclear Power. You can find more about their group at cgnp.org. You can donate there. You can find what Carl has been writing lately, which I found has just been really good. His piece, The Failure of California's Electricity Policy, Part 2, is on California Globe website. So you can find him there. But I've just appointed you Governor Carl, or maybe
Oh, man.
electricity
Oh,
electricity
former
potentate
responsibility.
electricity potentate in California. What do you do? Because you've had, let's face it, and I'm watching it from Texas, and I've been in California many times. Terrible policy. I mean, terrible and regressive energy and policy, and for a long time. What are the things you would do right away that would help straighten this out? What are the things that you would mandate or you would start advocating for that you think would have the most impact?
I hate to sound defeatist about this, but I really think that advocacy is limited on what you can achieve. I've always felt from the
And why
beginning.
is that? I'm sorry to interrupt, but you think advocacy is limited because of the strength of the NGOs? Because you said you sound defeatist, but explain why. That the advocacy is limited in terms of its value.
Well, in terms of grassroots stuff, in terms of getting out and marching down the street and stuff like that, I don't, or writing to your congressman. I don't want to discourage that because it can only help, but just in terms of how much it helps, I don't know that it's worth anybody's time to do that. I really can't say that that's the case. We've written more letters that I can remember,
Mm-hmm.
and never gotten a response. And politics doesn't work that way, at least in California. I'm assuming it's pretty much the same elsewhere. But um, I think right now, what I felt for a while is that the electric grid is going to have to go south big time for people to understand rural grid reliability. Growing up in Illinois, we had power outages all the time, and we understand what it's like to lose a refrigerator full of food because it's out for a day, and all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden you got to throw everything away.
Right.
You don't have any access to television, to your internet, to whatever. You're just down for the count. You're got candles.
Right.
You're lighting candles like they did 300 years ago. But it really will have to come to that before people understand reliable energy.
Well, fair enough. So you're saying California's going to need another crisis. Things are going to have to be bad, but I don't disagree. And I'm putting you on the spot here, and I apologize for that, or maybe I don't apologize. Heck, you came on, so I can abuse you a little bit. But what would you do? I mean, if I was gonna make you governor, I would assume the first thing you would say, well, damn it, we're keeping Diablo Canyon open. We are not gonna close this, and I'm gonna do whatever I can to prevent it from closing. I'm gonna give you those first of your 3 action items if I'm appointing you governor. But
Okay.
what else would you do? Because you need really a reworking of the policy framework in California, don't you, to disabuse people about the renewables? What would you, if you're czar, how would you handle it?
I haven't really thought about that because I haven't been in a position to do anything about it. However, I think probably in general terms, I think simplifying, like in any engineering task, make it more complicated than it needs to be, makes it less reliable.
Mm,
My son is an engineer. Uh, he's following a career path. I'm kind of living through him in one sense, but I'm very interested in engineering, and anytime you make an engineering problem more complicated, you make it less reliable, and that's what's happened in California. We have all of these different generators, 1,500 different power plants now. It's hard enough to get a reliable supply of grid electricity for everybody the way it is now, and we want to add more supply. There's a bill in California Assembly now that Newsom wants to make it possible, or I don't know if it's Newsom, it's sponsored by an assemblyman, but they want to make it possible for anybody to contribute electricity to the grid at any time. That we need everybody to pitch in and power the electrical grid. And I'm thinking this is just a recipe for disaster. People don't understand how hard it is to provide a reliable supply of electricity.
That's an interesting point that you make there, and that rhymes with how I see it, because I've thought a lot about, if you think back to the days of Edison and Insull, their idea was we're going to build the biggest power plant we can, and we're going to run that sucker as hard as we can, as long as we can, and sell power 24/7. Right? That was, Edison just started with lights, but then it became motors, right? And power was the other part of the big growth for industry. But your point about making it more simplifying the grid, I think that makes a lot of sense. So, okay, so we're working through this now. I've got the power to point you czar. You save Diablo Canyon, and maybe you look at trying to reopen San Onofre. I don't know. You simplify the grid, and then what about renewables and transmission? Do you give up on renewables and say, no, we're going full bore nuclear now? We're going to deploy more nuclear. We're not going to build any more renewables. How forceful and what direction would you take in that regard? I'm prompting you here.
Okay. Robert, I don't know how practical it is to try to go full bore nuclear. I think that would be the best solution. I mean, France did it in the 1970s. They took 75% of their carbon emissions out of their electricity supply in 13 years. I mean,
Yeah.
that's something that's never been achieved anywhere else in the world. 10 times, they cut their carbon emissions in half 10 times faster than Germany did it
Mm,
between 1990 and now. So I think that would be the ideal way. Politically, I don't think it's possible. I think
okay.
it would be something that would have to happen incrementally. But I don't know what the best way to go about that would be. I just,
Well, so first things first, keep Diablo Canyon open and then
yeah.
look at it and then follow on from there. Okay.
And
Well, that's
one
fair
thing,
enough. Go ahead.
I just want to throw in here, one thing that people don't understand, the grid was designed in a very specific way to carry electricity from big power plants out to outlying areas.
Right.
The big wires are all by the power plant, and it's like a tree, branches of a tree. They split out into smaller uh, electricity lines. We've run into a problem now called binding grid constraints, where people try to run it backwards. They think you can go any way on an electricity grid, but that's not how the physics of it work. You cannot just reroute a ton of electricity through these smaller wires because they'll melt from the poles, literally.
Mm.
So there's all kinds of software
Because you're running
protection.
too much amperage through them then?
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Okay.
So there are all kinds of protections built into the software at KAISA that figures out that you can't do that. And that's part of the reason why we're having these problems. It's all congestion problems.
Around
You know?
transmission, which is incredibly difficult to build anywhere, but it's especially difficult to build in California.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, and if I'm getting off base,
No,
stop me.
go ahead.
We're going back to this electricity system that existed in the 1880s in New York City and Philadelphia, where they had a different generation, a different coal plant in each block,
Right.
and they had power poles with hundreds of lines running down them, and they were trying to have competition back then too, and it was a mess. It was constant fires and explosions, and there were no standards. If you bought a lamp that fit one plug, it wouldn't fit in the plug next door. And all this stuff was a process that was worked through in the first 30 years of electricity in the United States that standardized everything and said, we're going to have big power plants that generate alternating current electricity that will spread out
Right.
like branches of a tree. And now we're going back to the old way of doing it, and we're running into the same problems that we had back then.
Well, it's interesting that you put it that way because I'm fascinated by those early days of electrification. But the word that pops in my head as you're saying that is some of the balkanization of the system. That
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
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 So just a couple last questions, Carl, if you don't mind. So, and thanks for your time. It's been fun to find out about your group and how you're thinking about these things. So what are you reading these days? This is a question I ask of all my guests. Are you reading books? Are you a novel reader? What do you read?
Oh, that's a good question. I just ordered Tristram Shandy, which was something I was not familiar with, and I just always a book I always wanted to read. Because I'm a big fan of Voltaire. But what else?
A big fan of Voltaire. I don't think we've had any Voltaire fans on the podcast. So okay.
But no, as far as technical stuff, I read physics. My daughter's a physicist, so I try to understand what she's doing. She's way off the theoretical end, so I can understand very little. But I try to keep up with a little bit with what she's working on. I honestly, I mean, I probably read less this year than I have in many years past because I've just been so busy with policy stuff. But
the one that I've finished most recently is Bad News by Batya Ungar Sargon about, and I need to have her on the podcast, but it's a really good book about the news media and woke culture and the change in the media business from the early days when reporters were generally working class, and today they're the elites. And so, that's one of the reasons why, in my view, they don't care about rural America. They don't report on rural America because they don't know that's not their people.
That's interesting. Yeah.
So the last question then, Carl, what gives you hope? What makes you optimistic about the future? You've been pretty, I wouldn't say measured in your optimism around Diablo Canyon, but you're obviously been putting a lot of time into Californians for Green Nuclear Power. What makes you hopeful?
What makes me hopeful is I see a shift happening, a nuclear renaissance happening, that there are more people every day understanding how important it is to have nuclear energy. And I still think I still have the same beliefs that I had 50 years ago, which is that nuclear power is the way of the future. And it's just a matter of getting people over a lot of misperceptions and irrational fears. But it's a cultural thing. I really think that will happen eventually. It's just a matter of time.
And so it's going to require, especially in California, Because I didn't ask you about that was the part about California that why is this anti-nuclear sentiment, so strong culturally in California? But that's maybe a longer discussion than we have time for. The peculiarities of California as a state
yes, that's another podcast.
or 10 or 12. Good. Well, listen, Carl, it's been great fun to chat with you. I wish you luck. Again, my guest is Carl Wurtz. He's the president of Californians for Green Nuclear Power. CGNP.org is where you find him. Carl, thanks a million for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Robert.
And thanks to all you Power Hungry podcast land out there. Tune in for the next episode. It's going to be as good as this one or maybe even better. Until then, see ya.